Manhattan, New York. In October 1964, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 59 years old, recently released from federal prison, and rebuilding his influence in Harlem while operating from his office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. Fifth Avenue was known for its wealth and exclusivity, a place where status mattered more than law, and where quiet racial barriers had existed for decades. The boutique Bergmann Sterling stood among the most refined stores in the city. It catered to Manhattan's richest families. For years, it had discouraged black customers through unwritten rules and social pressure. Only after the Civil Rights Act of July 1964 did such stores begin, reluctantly, to comply with federal law. At the time, Bumpy Johnson was one of the most recognized and feared figures in Harlem. He was known in both the criminal underworld and legitimate business circles. The environment of New York rewarded wealth, connections, and public confidence. It punished weakness and public embarrassment. In this climate, power was not only about money. It was about reputation, alliances, and the ability to respond when challenged. On Saturday, October 10, 1964, at 2:47 in the afternoon, Bumpy's wife, Mayme Johnson, 58, and his daughter, Ruthie Johnson, 29, entered Bergmann Sterling. They were dressed with care and dignity. They intended to purchase evening wear. For 15 minutes, they were treated with formal courtesy. At 3:02 p.m., Charles Whitfield Peyton III entered the store. Peyton was 64 years old, a real estate developer who controlled 19 buildings in Midtown Manhattan. His fortune was estimated at $45 million. He had a reputation for refusing to rent to black families and for maintaining strict social boundaries. When Peyton saw the two women being served, witnesses later reported that he became visibly angry. He approached them and began shouting racial insults. He accused them of not belonging in the store. He claimed the Civil Rights Act was wrong. He threw a $650 evening gown to the floor, saying it had been contaminated. He demanded they leave. 7 customers and 3 employees later confirmed the incident. The confrontation lasted between 5 and 7 minutes. May and Ruthie did not respond. They left the store in silence. Peyton did not know that the 2 women he had humiliated were connected to a man who understood power in a different way. That same afternoon, at approximately 4:30 p.m., May and Ruthie arrived at Bumpy Johnson's office in Harlem. What followed would unfold over the next 72 hours and would alter the balance of power in Manhattan's business world. By October 1964, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as a central figure in Harlem. He was known as both a criminal leader and a community strategist. Though he had served time in federal prison, he returned with discipline and patience. He did not move quickly without thought. A former numbers operator who had survived decades of gang wars, federal prosecutions, and shifting alliances, he carried himself with quiet control. Those around him described him as calm in moments of crisis. When angered, he did not shout. He calculated. Among Harlem residents and many civil rights organizers, he represented protection and leverage in a system dominated by wealthy white businessmen and institutions that had long excluded black citizens. He understood that power in New York was not only enforced through violence. It was enforced through banks, newspapers, social clubs, and public image. After hearing his daughter describe the insults, Johnson asked only one question: did anyone get the man's name? Within hours, he learned that the man was Charles Peyton. By early Sunday morning, October 11th, Johnson had gathered information about Peyton's finances. Peyton's empire depended on large loans. He operated with heavy debt. His projects required constant bank approval and investor confidence. Johnson did not order violence. Instead, he began making calls. Over the next 2 days, information about Peyton's financial risks was delivered to 3 banks that financed his projects. The information was accurate but emphasized his dependence on credit and the reputational risk created by public racism after the Civil Rights Act. By Monday morning, October 12th, the banks initiated reviews of his loans. Civil rights organizations, including CORE and the NAACP, organized peaceful protests at Peyton's properties. Newspapers reported the Fifth Avenue incident. Tenants in Peaton's buildings organized and prepared rent strikes. Business partners received warnings about negative publicity. 2 country clubs reviewed his membership. By Tuesday morning, 2 banks called $9 million in loans. 4 partners withdrew from development projects. 1 country club expelled him. Another suspended him. Tenants announced organized rent strikes affecting $60,000 in monthly income. Peaton's social circle began to distance itself. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. On Wednesday, October 14, Peaton received a visit from Theodore Green, an attorney connected to Harlem business interests. Green informed him that the collapse was not random. It was retaliation for his actions on October 10. Johnson did not appear in person. He did not threaten physical harm. His message was direct: the damage was done. The Civil Rights Act meant something. Actions carried consequences. 1 week later, on October 17, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergmann Sterling. They were greeted with apologies. They were served with full courtesy. Peaton was permanently banned from the store. By February 1965, Peaton's fortune had dropped from $45 million to approximately $11 million. He sold 14 of his 19 buildings. His wife filed for separation. His reputation did not recover. Those who knew Johnson did not hear him speak of the matter again. But within Harlem and beyond, the message was understood. In October 1964, power had shifted. The law alone did not enforce dignity. But in this case, strategy did. But not everyone respected Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. One figure in particular, Charles Whitfield Peaton III, embodied a different kind of danger. He was not a street criminal. He did not carry weapons or command men in alleyways. His power was built in boardrooms and bank offices. It was expressed through contracts, leases, and social influence. Peaton was a 64-year-old real estate developer. He had inherited $12 million from his grandfather's shipping fortune and expanded it into an empire valued at $45 million. He owned 19 buildings in Midtown Manhattan. He sat on the boards of banks. He belonged to exclusive country clubs. He moved comfortably among New York's business elite. He was known for refusing to rent apartments to black families and to Puerto Rican tenants. Witnesses described his views as openly racist. He believed certain neighborhoods and certain institutions belonged only to what he called proper society. He believed wealth justified exclusion. He believed social standing protected him from criticism. On October 10, 1964, he walked into Bergmann Sterling expecting to collect custom-tailored suits. When he saw May and Ruthie Johnson being served, he reacted with public rage. He shouted racial slurs. He accused them of contaminating the store. He called the Civil Rights Act communist legislation. He demanded they leave. He acted as if the law did not apply to him. Peaton had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. For years, discrimination in housing had been practiced quietly. Stores had discouraged black customers through silence and hostility rather than written rules. Men like Peaton had rarely faced direct punishment. Even when challenged, they relied on lawyers, influence, and delay. He believed that his wealth and connections would protect him. He believed that if controversy arose, it would fade. He believed that social power was stronger than federal law. In public, he carried himself with entitlement. In private, he managed his empire through leverage and pressure. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as maintaining order. He saw no danger in humiliating 2 women in a store because he assumed they were powerless. He did not ask who they were connected to. He did not consider that power in New York was changing. For Peaton, discrimination had always been low risk. He believed the Civil Rights Act was symbolic, not practical. He believed banks, clubs, and partners would stand with him if conflict arose. He was wrong. Peaton continued his behavior by exploiting weaknesses in the system. Housing discrimination was difficult to prove. Landlords could claim apartments were unavailable. They could set high requirements. They could delay applications. Enforcement of the new Civil Rights Act depended on complaints, documentation, and legal action. Many victims lacked resources to challenge wealthy developers. Banks focused on profit, not fairness. As long as loans were repaid, lenders rarely questioned a borrower's personal conduct. Country clubs maintained private membership rules that avoided direct legal language while preserving exclusivity. Social circles protected their own. Authority tolerated this because change was new and uncertain. The Civil Rights Act had been signed only 3 months earlier in July 1964. Courts were still interpreting its limits. Many business leaders believed enforcement would be slow. They assumed discrimination would continue quietly, even if it disappeared from public statements. Peyton benefited from this hesitation. He operated with large loans and heavy debt, but lenders trusted his history of profits. He held influence in social institutions that valued reputation over justice. His partners expected returns, not reform. In this environment, racism could survive behind polite language and legal technicalities. When he attacked Mayme and Ruthie Johnson, he expected no real consequence. He believed that public outrage would fade. He believed that 2 black women had no leverage against a man worth $45 million. Over time, Peyton came to believe himself untouchable. Each year without serious challenge strengthened his confidence. Each successful deal confirmed his view that power belonged to those who controlled property and credit. He saw the civil rights movement as political noise, not structural change. But October 1964 was not October 1954. The law had shifted. Public opinion was shifting. Civil rights organizations were organized and alert. Newspapers were willing to report open racism. Banks were becoming sensitive to reputational risk. Peyton did not see these changes clearly. He underestimated the new alliances forming across Harlem and beyond. He did not understand that economic pressure could be applied as precisely as legal force. When authority fails to act directly, power can move through other channels. In this case, the system that once shielded Peyton would become the same system used to dismantle his empire. The first incident occurred during a routine moment on Saturday afternoon, October 10, 1964, inside Bergmann Sterling on 5th Avenue. Mayme Johnson and her daughter Ruthie were browsing evening gowns. They had been inside the store for about 15 minutes. A sales clerk was showing them dresses from the fall collection. Their visit had been calm and orderly. Other customers watched with quiet curiosity, but no one had interfered. Then Charles Whitfield Peyton III entered the store. Without warning, and without any personal exchange with the women, Peyton walked toward them and began shouting. He did not speak quietly. He did not ask questions. He accused them of not belonging. He used racial slurs that witnesses later refused to repeat in print. He declared that stores like Bergmann Sterling were meant for white society. He grabbed a $650 evening gown that Ruthie had been examining and threw it onto the floor. He said the dress was ruined because a black woman had touched it. He offered to pay for it if the store destroyed it rather than sell it. He demanded that the manager explain why these people had been allowed inside. The store fell silent. Customers watched. Employees stood still. Mayme Johnson did not argue. Ruthie did not respond. They did not raise their voices. They did not defend themselves publicly. Witnesses reported that Ruthie began to cry quietly, but she did not speak. Mayme took her daughter's hand. They walked toward the door with steady steps. Their heads were held high. They did not run. They did not plead. They did not shout back. To many observers, this appeared as weakness. Some saw 2 women absorbing abuse without resistance. Some believed they had no power to answer. The store staff did not intervene. Other customers did not defend them. Peyton continued shouting until they exited onto the sidewalk. The moment ended without violence. No police were called. No one was struck. The women left quietly. But the silence was not surrender. Later that afternoon, at approximately 4:30 p.m., Mayme and Ruthie arrived at Bumpy Johnson's office in Harlem. Ruthie described what had happened. Mayme initially tried to minimize the incident. She did not want additional attention. Johnson listened. He asked for the man's name. He did not shout. He did not strike the table. He did not promise revenge in dramatic language. He told his wife and daughter to go home and rest. "I'll handle it," he said. To anyone present, the words were calm. To those who knew him, the tone meant something else. Those close to Bumpy Johnson expected a different reaction. William "Bub" Hewlett, his bodyguard, later said he thought Johnson would respond immediately and directly. In the past, insults had sometimes been answered swiftly. In Harlem, reputation mattered. Public humiliation could not go unanswered. Some associates assumed that men might be sent to confront Peyton. Others expected threats or visible retaliation. But restraint was deliberate. Johnson spent the next hours gathering information. He contacted his attorney, Theodore Green. He called business associates. He asked about Peyton's holdings, his loans, his partners, and his social connections. He did not move in anger. He moved in calculation. Those who understood the environment recognized patience as strategy. In October 1964, open violence would have drawn law enforcement attention. Johnson had been released from federal prison only 11 months earlier. A public confrontation would have risked new charges and renewed surveillance. Instead, he studied the structure that protected Peyton. He learned that Peyton's empire depended on heavy borrowing. He learned that his development projects were leveraged. He learned that his reputation mattered to banks, partners, and private clubs. Johnson understood that power in Manhattan was built on confidence and credit. Remove confidence, and credit disappears. By Sunday morning, October 11th, he had a plan. He would not strike Peyton in the street. He would strike the foundations of his empire. To outsiders, the quiet on Saturday evening may have seemed like surrender. There were no public statements. No visible threats. No press conference. No retaliation at the store. But those who knew Johnson recognized a pattern. When he became silent, he was preparing. In Harlem, people began to hear whispers that something had happened on Fifth Avenue. They did not yet know details. They did not know names. But they understood that if someone had insulted Bumpy Johnson's family, the response would not be loud at first. It would be precise. And when it came, it would not look like anger. It would look like consequences. The next incident occurred on Sunday afternoon, October 11th, at three banks that financed Charles Peyton's development projects. Loan officers received detailed financial analyses of Peyton's holdings. The reports were accurate. They showed how heavily leveraged his projects were. They noted delays and cost overruns. They also referenced the public racist incident at Bergmann Sterling and the reputational risk it created after the Civil Rights Act. This time, the provocation was worse for Peyton. His access to credit was questioned. Again, Bumpy Johnson remained restrained. He did not appear in public. He did not issue threats. He did not confront Peyton directly. He allowed the system to begin examining the risk on its own terms. Each incident increased Peyton's confidence at first. He believed the reviews were routine. He assumed his banking relationships would protect him. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. When a man believes he is protected by status, he ignores warning signs. The next incident occurred Monday morning, October 12th, outside Peyton's largest residential building on West 86th Street. Approximately 50 protesters organized by CORE and the NAACP gathered on the sidewalk. They carried signs accusing Peyton of discrimination. They distributed flyers describing the October 10th incident. The protest was peaceful and legal. This time, the provocation was public and visible. Tenants and neighbors saw the signs. Reporters took photographs. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He did not stand among the protesters. He did not claim credit. Civil rights leaders spoke for themselves. Each incident increased Peyton's confidence in a different way. He believed protests would fade after a day or two. He believed controversy was temporary. In environments like Manhattan real estate, public image is currency. Once doubt enters, it spreads. The next incident occurred Monday evening at a Harlem church. Approximately 200 tenants from 9 of Peyton's buildings met and formed a tenant organization. They discussed rent strikes, legal complaints, and collective action. Lawyers were present to advise them of their rights under the new Civil Rights Act. This time, The provocation affected revenue. Again, Johnson remained restrained. He funded printing and meeting space through intermediaries. He did not appear on stage. He did not speak to the press. Each incident increased Peaton's confidence in his ability to manage the crisis. He believed he could evict tenants. He believed courts would favor landlords. In environments built on leverage, cash flow is survival. Interrupt the flow, and the structure weakens. The next incident occurred Tuesday morning, October 13th, inside two of Peaton's primary banks. Both institutions exercised clauses in their loan agreements and called a total of $9 million in loans. The banks cited increased risk and reputational concerns. This time, the provocation threatened collapse. Again, Johnson remained restrained. There was no celebration in Harlem. There were no public statements. Each incident increased Peaton's confidence until it turned into confusion. He could not see the pattern. He did not understand how multiple pressures had begun at the same time. In environments like high finance, sudden loss of credit becomes fatal. The next incident occurred later that Tuesday among Peaton's business partners. Four partners withdrew from joint projects. They cited concerns about negative publicity and financial instability. Peaton was forced to consider buying out their shares. This time, the provocation touched reputation and alliances. Again, Johnson remained restrained. Each incident increased Peaton's sense of isolation. But he still believed he could recover. In systems built on trust, once partners lose faith, the damage multiplies. By Tuesday evening, the escalation was complete. Banks demanded payment. Tenants organized rent strikes. Civil rights protests continued daily. Country clubs reviewed his membership. Peaton's confidence had become dangerous because it had blinded him to the scale of coordinated pressure. He had once believed himself untouchable. Now, the system he relied on was tightening around him. Everything changed when Peaton's conduct crossed into the public record and into the broader civil rights movement. The symbolic boundary was not only the insult to May and Ruthie Johnson. It was the moment his words became evidence of open defiance against the Civil Rights Act in October 1964. Newspapers began reporting the confrontation at Bergmann and Sterling. The New York Amsterdam News ran a front-page story. The New York Times published coverage of discrimination allegations at a Fifth Avenue boutique. His behavior was no longer private. It was documented. This incident crossed a line. Discrimination had often been quiet and indirect. But Peaton had shouted racial slurs in a luxury store. He had thrown merchandise to the floor. He had declared federal law illegitimate. Witnesses confirmed it. Authority response was minimal in direct legal terms. Police did not arrest him. No criminal charges were filed. There was no immediate court action. But institutions began reacting to risk. Country clubs placed his membership under review. One asked him to resign. Social invitations stopped. Banks justified loan calls under contractual clauses. Partners distanced themselves to protect their own reputations. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. On Wednesday, October 14th, when Theodore Green visited Peaton's office and explained the origin of the pressure, the structure had already shifted. The loans were called. The protests were organized. The tenants were united. The press had published. There was no single act left to undo. Peaton asked what he could do to stop it. The answer was nothing. The line had been crossed on October 10th when he believed humiliation carried no cost. Once the machinery of finance, media, civil rights activism, and social standing moved together, reversal was impossible. In Manhattan, reputation is capital. When capital disappears, power follows. And in October 1964, the rules had changed. That evening, after the events of October 10th had been explained to him, Bumpy Johnson spoke quietly in his office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. The room was calm. The noise of Harlem moved outside as it always did. Inside, there was no shouting. No dramatic gestures. His wife and daughter had already gone home. Only close associates remained. Johnson did not threaten Charles Peaton by name in public. He did not order immediate retaliation. He did not speak of violence. He asked questions. He asked about Peyton's buildings. He asked about his loans. He asked about his partners. He asked which banks financed his projects. He asked about his social clubs. Then he said, "I'll handle it." The words were simple. The tone was even. Those who heard him understood the meaning. William Hewlett later recalled that Johnson's voice was colder than anger. It carried certainty. When Johnson reached that tone, action would follow, but not in haste. He explained that no one was to act recklessly. No one was to draw police attention. He had been out of federal prison for only 11 months. He would not return because of impulse. He stated that respect mattered. He stated that the Civil Rights Act had changed the landscape. He stated that men who believed themselves untouchable would learn otherwise. He did not raise his voice. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of consequences. Johnson told his attorney, Theodore Green, to gather information. He told associates to move carefully. He made clear that nothing illegal would connect back to him directly. Those who sat in that office understood something important. When Johnson chose patience, it meant the response would be controlled. When he chose strategy over anger, it meant the outcome would be lasting. He did not need to describe the plan in full detail. The men around him had seen similar patterns before. When someone crossed a line involving his family, the response would not be loud. It would be precise. That night, there were no headlines. There were no visible confrontations. But the direction had been set. And once Johnson set a direction, it rarely changed. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. It was Saturday, October 17, 1964. 1 week after the confrontation. The time was 2:45 in the afternoon. Fifth Avenue moved as it always did. Well-dressed shoppers entered and exited stores. Taxis passed. Doormen stood in place. Bergmann Sterling opened its doors at the usual hour. The display windows showed full collections. Inside, clerks arranged merchandise. The polished floors reflected the afternoon light. Routine continued as usual. Customers browsed racks of dresses. Sales staff greeted patrons with polite phrases. There was no sign of tension in the air. There were no police barriers. No raised voices. But outside the store, several observers were present. Approximately 30 members of CORE and the NAACP stood at a respectful distance. They were not shouting. They were not blocking entrances. They were watching. Theodore Green stood nearby. William Hewlett positioned himself close to the entrance but did not enter the store. Inside, employees had been instructed. The manager had prepared for the visit. At 2:45 p.m., Mayme Johnson and Ruthie Johnson approached the doors. They were dressed with the same dignity as before. They walked at the same pace. They did not hesitate. The setting was the same store. The same city. The same sidewalk. But the balance had shifted. Routine actions now carried weight. A greeting at the door meant more than courtesy. A sales clerk's tone meant more than professionalism. The manager stepped forward personally. He apologized for what had happened on October 10th. He assured them they were welcome. He informed them that Charles Peyton was permanently banned from the premises. Inside, they were shown the finest selections. 3 clerks attended them. Other customers offered polite conversation. No one challenged their presence. The visit lasted 90 minutes. They purchased approximately $1,500 worth of clothing and accessories. The manager wrapped each item carefully and escorted them to the door. Outside, observers applauded quietly. The setting remained ordinary, a retail store on Fifth Avenue in mid-afternoon. Yet what followed became unforgettable because of the contrast. 1 week earlier, 2 women had been humiliated in public. Now, they were treated with full respect under the protection of law and community pressure. The city continued moving around them. Traffic flowed. Shoppers entered and exited. Newspapers were delivered. But within that ordinary setting, a message had been delivered without a single shouted threat. Respect had been enforced. And those who understood power in October 1964 recognized that something irreversible had taken place. By Wednesday morning, October 14, 1964, Charles Whitfield Peaton III understood that his world was collapsing. Banks had called $9 million in loans. Business partners had withdrawn from projects. Tenants had organized rent strikes. Newspapers were printing his name alongside accusations of racism. One country club had expelled him. Another had suspended his membership. He spent the morning making frantic phone calls. Shortly after 2:30 p.m., Theodore Green entered Peaton's Midtown office. Green introduced himself as an attorney representing Harlem business interests. Peaton was unshaven. Papers covered his desk. Financial statements were spread across the floor. He appeared exhausted. Green explained the situation calmly. He described the October 10 incident at Bergmann Sterling. He described the banks, the protests, the tenants, the partners, and the social isolation. He told Peaton that the collapse was not random. It was a response. Peaton reacted with disbelief. He said Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who had no control over banks or country clubs. He insisted that the crisis could not be connected to two women in a store. But Green continued. He explained that Johnson had relationships across communities. He explained that in October 1964, after the Civil Rights Act, public racism carried new risks. He explained that institutions did not want to be associated with open defiance of federal law. Peaton's final provocation was not shouted in a store. It was his refusal to accept responsibility. He asked what he could do to make the pressure stop. He asked how he could fix it. He asked how to persuade Johnson to reverse the damage. Green's answer was clear. Nothing. The loans had already been called. The partners had already withdrawn. The tenants were already organized. The press had already published. This time, there was no ambiguity. The humiliation Peaton had delivered on October 10 had returned in a different form. It was not loud. It was not violent. But it was complete. At that moment, the escalation ended. Bumpy Johnson did not need to appear in the office. He did not need to shout. He did not need to threaten. His decision had already been executed. He had stood, not in a store aisle, but through institutions. And Peaton understood that the shift was permanent. According to witnesses, everything that destroyed Charles Peaton's empire happened in seconds at each critical point. A bank officer signed a notice calling a loan. A partner signed a withdrawal agreement. A country club board voted to expel a member. A newspaper editor approved a headline. Movements were precise. There was no mob. No gunfire. No physical confrontation. The action was economic and social, but it carried force. Before intervention was possible, the outcome was decided. When two banks demanded immediate repayment of $9 million, Peaton did not have the liquid funds. That decision alone forced emergency measures. Properties had to be sold. Negotiations began under pressure. When four partners withdrew from joint developments, contracts required Peaton to buy out their stakes or dissolve projects. Each signature reduced his leverage. When tenants deposited rent into escrow accounts instead of paying him directly, cash flow tightened. Legal costs increased. Public scrutiny expanded. When one country club expelled him and another suspended him, social standing collapsed. Invitations stopped. Long-standing relationships grew distant. These actions did not require confrontation in a single room. They required coordination. Witnesses later described the pace as overwhelming. By Tuesday evening, October 13, the cumulative weight had become clear. By Wednesday afternoon, October 14, the explanation had been delivered in person. The decisive action was not a punch. It was the calling of credit. It was the withdrawal of trust. It was the closing of doors. Within months, Peaton was forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings. His net worth fell from $45 million to approximately $11 million by February 1965. There was no dramatic final fight. The collapse unfolded through documents, contracts, and votes. Before Peaton could reorganize, before he could stabilize financing, before he could repair his reputation, the damage had become irreversible. Those who observed the events understood the lesson. In October 1964, Power could be exercised without physical violence. It could move through banks, through civil rights organizations, through media, through social institutions. And once those channels aligned, resistance became impossible. The outcome had been decided the moment Peyton believed humiliation carried no cost. Everything after that was execution. By the afternoon of Wednesday, October 14, 1964, the message had been delivered. Theodore Green left Charles Peyton's office without raising his voice. He did not threaten. He did not argue. He simply stated that the damage was done and that nothing could reverse it. There was no police arrival. No court summons at that moment. No public confrontation in the hallway. The surrender was quieter than that. It came in Peyton's silence. After Green explained that the collapse of loans, partnerships, protests, and social standing had been a coordinated response to the events of October 10, Peyton reportedly sat motionless behind his desk. Witnesses close to him later said he did not shout again about the Civil Rights Act. He did not repeat his earlier claims that it was meaningless. He did not defend his behavior at Bergmann Sterling. For the first time, he understood that power had shifted. Meanwhile, in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson did not escalate further. He did not pursue physical harm. He did not seek public credit. He did not appear before reporters. He stopped immediately. Once the objective had been achieved, once Peyton's financial and social structure had been broken, Johnson made no additional moves. He did not resist authority because there was no authority to confront him directly. Every action taken had been legal. Banks had exercised contractual rights. Civil rights groups had organized lawful protests. Tenants had asserted legal protections. Johnson remained in the background. When contacted for comment, he declined through his attorney. The written statement was brief and formal. It denied involvement in Peyton's financial problems and affirmed support for equal dignity under the Civil Rights Act. There was no boasting. There was no public celebration. Before the week ended, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergmann and Sterling on October 17. They were treated with respect. The store manager apologized. Charles Peyton was permanently banned from the premises. That was the final act. Peyton had no further escalation. His empire was shrinking. His name had become associated with public racism at a time when such behavior carried consequences. In private conversations, he reportedly asked what he could have done differently. But the answer had already been delivered. Bumpy Johnson did not send another message. He did not summon Peyton for confrontation. He did not extend the conflict beyond what had already occurred. Before the pressure fully removed Peyton from his former standing, Johnson delivered a single, final line through Theodore Green. Consider this an expensive lesson about respect. Nothing more was added. It was not shouted. It was not repeated. The resolution did not require a final battle. By December 1964, Peyton had sold 14 of his 19 buildings. By February 1965, his fortune had dropped from $45 million to approximately $11 million. His social circle had withdrawn. His wife filed for separation in January 1965. Johnson did not pursue him further. The objective had never been total destruction of the man's life. It had been correction. In October 1964, correction meant demonstrating that humiliation of black citizens under federal law would not pass without cost. Johnson had applied pressure through institutions rather than through force. When the pressure achieved its purpose, he ceased. There was no resistance to authority because authority had been used, not opposed. There was no public duel. There was a shift in balance. And in that shift, a man who believed himself untouchable learned otherwise. The surrender was not dramatic. It was controlled. It was quiet. And it was complete. Charles Whitfield Peyton III survived the immediate crisis. He was not imprisoned. He was not assaulted. He remained alive and free. But the consequences were lasting. By December 1964, he had been forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings. He needed cash to respond to the $9 million in loans that had been called. He had to buy out partners who no longer wished to be connected to him. He sold properties at losses. By February 1965, His net worth had dropped from $45 million to approximately $11 million. One country club expelled him permanently. Another ended his membership after review. Social invitations stopped. Families who once welcomed him to dinner now declined quietly. His wife filed for separation in January 1965 and moved away from Manhattan society. He attempted to rebuild his reputation in 1965 and 1966, but lenders were cautious. Partners hesitated. Tenants remembered. His name carried risk. He survived, but not as he had been. Across Manhattan, behavior changed. Retail stores that had once relied on informal exclusion began training staff in non-discriminatory service. Bergmann Sterling hired its first black sales clerk in November 1964. The store began advertising in black newspapers, stating clearly that all customers would be served with respect. Other Fifth Avenue boutiques followed slowly through 1965. Some acted out of legal obligation. Others acted out of caution. The lesson had been observed. Real estate offices reviewed their rental practices more carefully. Public discrimination became rare. Landlords who continued to discriminate did so more quietly, aware that exposure could trigger organized response. The message required no repetition. No speech was delivered from a podium. No official declaration was made. But in boardrooms and private clubs, the events of October 1964 were discussed. Businessmen understood that open racism, especially after the Civil Rights Act, could carry financial cost. They understood something else as well. Power in New York no longer flowed in only one direction. It could move from Harlem outward. When the events were later reviewed by journalists and observers, a pattern emerged. It began with escalation. On October 10, 1964, Peyton publicly humiliated two black women at Bergmann Sterling. He shouted racial slurs. He threw a dress to the floor. He declared federal law meaningless. Witnesses confirmed the scene. Newspapers documented the incident. Warnings followed. Banks received financial analyses highlighting Peyton's leverage and reputational risk. Civil rights organizations organized lawful protests. Tenants formed associations. Business partners were informed of potential damage to their own reputations. None of these steps were illegal. Each action relied on existing structures, contracts, media, protest rights, and financial review. System failure had allowed discrimination to continue quietly for years. Weak enforcement, social tolerance, and institutional hesitation had protected men like Peyton. But after July 1964, the legal environment had changed. The Civil Rights Act provided a framework. Public opinion was shifting. Institutions were sensitive to risk. When all elements aligned, financial exposure, organized protest, tenant action, media attention, and social pressure, the system that once shielded Peyton became the system that dismantled his position. The conclusion was unavoidable. Peyton's collapse was not random. It followed sequence. Public provocation. Strategic patience. Institutional pressure. Financial consequences. Social isolation. Within 72 hours, the structure of his empire began to weaken. Within 4 months, his fortune had lost $34 million. No court convicted him of a crime related to the store incident. No jury issued a sentence. But the economic and social penalties were real. Observers in Harlem saw validation that organized pressure could enforce dignity when formal legal remedies were slow. Observers in Manhattan's business elite saw confirmation that the environment had shifted. October 1964 was not October 1954. Public racism carried cost. The review of events did not uncover hidden violence. It did not reveal forged documents or illegal coercion. It revealed coordination, timing, and understanding of leverage. The escalation had been measured. The warnings had been ignored. The system that once tolerated discrimination had finally reacted to it. And once it reacted, the outcome could not be reversed. The pattern stood clear. An insult delivered in confidence. A response delivered in strategy. A transformation delivered without repetition. That was the lasting record of October 1964. Long after the incident of October 1964, the story continued to circulate across Harlem and throughout Manhattan's business circles. It was told in quiet conversations. It was repeated in offices and at dinner tables. It moved through civil rights meetings and through private clubs. Not because of spectacle. There had been no public fight. No gunfire. No courtroom drama. No dramatic arrest. But because of meaning. People remembered that a wealthy real estate developer had publicly humiliated two black women in a Fifth Avenue store. They remembered that within days, his banks withdrew support, his partners stepped away, his tenants organized, and his social standing collapsed. They remembered that the Civil Rights Act had been signed only 3 months earlier. Many had doubted whether it would change daily life. Some believed it was only words on paper. The events of that week suggested otherwise. In places like Manhattan, power often hides behind contracts and custom. It protects itself through influence and tradition. For years, discrimination had survived quietly under those protections. But in October 1964, the lesson became clear. The law alone does not enforce change. People do. When institutions feel risk, they move. When reputation is threatened, alliances shift. When public humiliation meets organized response, outcomes follow. Bumpy Johnson never gave a public speech about what happened. He never claimed credit. Through his attorney, he denied direct involvement in Peyton's financial collapse. But among those who watched closely, the connection required no explanation. The story became a cautionary example. For businessmen, it was a reminder that public racism carried economic cost. For civil rights organizers, it showed that lawful pressure could reshape behavior. For Harlem, it confirmed that dignity could be defended, even against wealth and social rank. The store that had once discouraged black customers hired its first black sales clerk weeks later. Other stores followed gradually. Landlords reviewed policies more carefully. Public discrimination became more dangerous. The transformation did not happen overnight across the entire city. But something had shifted. The meaning was not about revenge. It was about balance. It was about the idea that humiliation delivered without fear of consequence could return in another form. In places like this, power belongs not only to those who shout the loudest, but to those who understand how systems move. The story endured because it marked a moment when the rules changed. And once rules change, memory preserves the example. Men who believed themselves untouchable began to measure their words more carefully. Institutions that once ignored injustice began to calculate risk differently. The lesson required no monument. It lived in behavior. It lived in silence. It lived in the understanding that October 1964 had drawn a line between two eras. Before that line, exclusion could hide behind habit. After that line, exclusion carried cost. Power shifts quietly, but once it shifts, it does not ask permission to remain.